Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a massive 11-game main slate here on DraftKings. We are also going to do our breakdown of the 3-game night slate today, so stay tuned in the video for that. We'll have that in the later part of the video. So we have two good slates here on DraftKings. For the main slate here, we have 11 games, a lot of really solid games in this one, a couple games where I feel like there could be some blowouts, but overall, it's a really good slate. I think there's a lot of good high-priced guys and a lot of good value plays as well. Though I do think guard is a lot better today than forward is. It seemed like forward, a lot of the guys were a little bit pricier per, point per dollar wise than the guards were. So I'm looking at maybe 5 guard, 3 forward lineup today. Gonna have to kind of play around with lineups to see what the best course of action is. But I've got some good plays here available for you. So let's go ahead and get started with the guards I do like on the main slate here. First, we're going to start with Traquavion Smith. Sorry for butchering. For North Carolina State, he's averaging. He's had 3 games under 30 fantasy points all season long. He plays a lot of minutes and he shoots a ton of shots. He also has a nice upside here in this plus matchup. He's getting some steals as well. He's had 1 game against Georgia Tech in his career, and he had 46 fantasy points in that one. He's averaging a ridiculous 1.08 fantasy points per minute. We definitely like guards who have more than 1 fantasy point per minute who play a lot of minutes. And he's definitely in the ballpark as a great option on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Marcus Cesar. Let's see here. For Houston, he has played extremely well lately. He's had 3 games all season under 25 fantasy points. His price is pretty solid here. He also gets a pretty good amount of minutes, and he's had a lot of games over 30 fantasy points, which is what we really want from him today. He's got big time upside. He's had 2 games in 4 career games against Tulane where he had over 20 fantasy points. He looks like he's in a really good spot, and he should have a really good opportunity in this game. Then we're going to look at Jarkel Joyner for North Carolina State. Another guy from them I like. He's averaging 0.77 fantasy points per minute, which is a little bit lower than I like. He has a few lower scoring games this season, but he has some decent upside here. He can hit over 40 fantasy points, and he has good potential and plays a good amount of minutes as well. So he is a viable option, but he is not my favorite option, but he is viable on this one. Then we're going to look at Santiago Viscasi for Tennessee. Now, he had a solid game against Kentucky, but it was a little bit underwhelming for what he wanted to do in the last game. But look for him to bounce back here. He's been really good all season long. He's had no games under 21 fantasy points all year. His price is a little bit... I wish his price was a little bit lower, but overall he has a pretty safe matchup. In 5 games against Mississippi State in his career, he's had 4 over 26 fantasy points. So he's got nice upside, and he also averages 0.9 fantasy points per minute, which is really solid. I think he's a viable option on the slate. Then we're going to look at Davion Smith for Georgia Tech. At $5,200, he has been coming off the bench the last 7 games, but his minutes have been about the same as since when he started earlier in the year, and he's been over 20 fantasy points in the last 4 games. I look for that to continue here. He's got some nice upside, assuming he plays a full complement of minutes, which he should in this particular one. He's also averaging 0.92 fantasy points per minute on the season, which is very nice in this situation. Then we're going to look at Trey Wirtz here for Notre Dame. He's averaging 0.6 fantasy points per minute, and his minutes are a little bit inconsistent. But he has no games under 12 fantasy points all season long, and he has 30 fantasy point upside. He's also a decent price here and does play a lot of minutes most of the time. So I do think he has a viability, despite the fact that he has a low fantasy points per minute. Then we're going to look at Jalen, excuse me, Worley for Florida State. He's near minimum priced here. He started the last 8 games, and he's not had any games in those last 8 under 12 fantasy points. He's got some nice upside here in the upper 20s. His price point is pretty cheap, and he's playing over 30 minutes a game most of the time. In 2 games against Notre Dame in his career, he had 17 and 24 fantasy points. So he has some nice upside in this situation with this price point. Then we're going to look at Javon Quinnery for Alabama. Now he comes off the bench and he kind of maxes out about 18 minutes a game when he does get his that many minutes. But he does have some upside here at a minimum price. He actually has some pretty big games occasionally. And so I'm looking for that here in a very plus matchup against Vanderbilt. In 3 games versus Vandy in his career, he's been over 20 fantasy points in all of them. I expect that to continue here. He is, his minutes are a little bit suspect because of a couple games where he only has played under, 10 or 12 minutes. But overall, he does have upside. He just has a very low floor on this season. But I do look at this type of game to be a situation we'll have more opportunity because I feel like, Bama might end up blowing them out, and so he'll get a little extra minutes as well. He is a little bit matchup proof from that perspective, so I do think he's a viable option on the slate. So then we're going to look at forwards. We're going to start with Baycott. Obviously, he's the top player on the slate. He's been really good for North Carolina. He did get injured a couple games ago, but he played against Louisville, and he played really well in that one, playing for a nice big double-double. He is a double-double machine. He's had a couple games early in the year under 29 fantasy points, but other than that, he's been extremely good. I expect him to have another double-double here and hopefully pay off in a nice plus matchup against Boston College. Then we'll look at Jalen Wilson for Kansas, who is averaging 1.03 fantasy points per game. I should mention that Baycott is at 1.28 fantasy points per game, which is just utterly ridiculous. But for Wilson, he's been over 30 fantasy points in most games this season. He's been over 30 in the last 6 straight, and he's had 40 fantasy point upside. He has got a nice plus matchup here, and I expect him to have a really good game. Obviously, he's pretty expensive, so you're going to have to get some value plays to play him if you want, but overall, there are plenty of value plays on the slate, so I think he's viable. Then we're going to look at Seth Lundy, who does have guard forward positioning available here. He's averaging 0.94 fantasy points per game for Penn State, and he's pretty reasonably priced here. He's only had a couple games under 20 fantasy points, and he has 40 fantasy point upside. He has some really good games against tough opponents lately, too, so he's playing really well the last 3 or 4 games. I expect that to continue and have him in a good position, though his price has come up a little bit, so do keep that in mind. Then we're going to look at Simas Lucrosis for Butler. Sorry for butchering your name, I'm not sure how to say it. But with that said, he has guarded and forward position as well. His price point at $6,000 is really good because he has a high ceiling, but he also has a pretty low floor, so do keep that in mind. He has some good games, over 30 fantasy points, and I look for him to have a good opportunity here. He's been good against Creighton in his career as well, having 2 games over 17 fantasy points. So he has some nice potential in this particular matchup. Then we're going to look at Uros Plavsic for Tennessee. Now, he is averaging a ridiculous 1.11 fantasy points per minute, and at $4,100, where he's getting around 20 or so minutes a game, he is a little inconsistent in the minutes perspective, but he has been good most games, and he is a tough guy to score against, and he also seems to score pretty easily when he gets the ball. He also a pretty decent rebounder. He should have a nice game here against a weak opponent against Mississippi State, who I don't think is going to be able to stop him very much. He was really solid against Kentucky when it comes to just scoring, and I expect Tennessee to kind of go back to that again in this game, though he is kind of an afterthought offensively sometimes. He does have pretty good upside in the mid-20s, even almost to 30, and he, obviously his minutes are the biggest issue here, but he does start, and so he has viability in this matchup. Then we'll look at Cameron Corrin for Florida State. He has some nice upside at this nearly minimum price. He started the last 5 games, and he's been pretty good in those games, though he does have a little bit of a low floor, but he's got a nice ceiling, and he has a good opportunity to have over 30 minutes in this one, and so I look for him to play well and play and get a really good score at a near minimum price for a position that's a little bit weak today. Then we're going to go over here to the night slate, and I'm going to talk just these games through here. These games are not super ideal. This slate is a little bit rougher than the main slate. Of course, there's only 3 games in it, so that's obviously part of it. So it's going to be a little bit harder to pay up for Oscar Tshiebwe maybe today, but it's still doable today. So let's go ahead and get into our guards. I have 4 guards and 4 forwards to talk about. We're gonna start with Tyree Appleby for Wake Forest at $8,600. He has 6 straight games over 30 fantasy points. He has had some good games all year, over 40 fantasy points as well. But he has some nice upside and a decent floor, so I do think he's a viable option. He's got 0.89 fantasy points per minute, and he's probably the best guard when it comes to just the pure, the highest from a high price perspective. I didn't really like anybody over 7,000 other than him, just because of the risk and the up and downs of the games that they've played. The next guy I like here. And I do think that he has some nice upside in this matchup, as long as he is back to full minutes. He should be have a better game than he had the last 3 games, where he was battling a back injury or soreness, I guess. So he looks like he's going to be good to go today, and should get back to playing 35, 40 minutes a game. And in this one, if he can do that, he's got a nice plus matchup. And he has big time upside in this matchup, and his price has come down quite a bit as a result of that injury from the last few games. Then we're going to look at Brevin Galloway here at $5,400. He at Clemson has a pretty low point per minute, but he has been playing really well the last 4 games. He's had 4 straight games over 20 fantasy points, and his minutes seem to have increased some in the last week or so, couple weeks. I think he's been really good against Duke last game as well. And if he can continue to build on that, he's going to continue to have some upside. His price is still pretty reasonable as well, and so I think he's a viable option on the slate. And then we're going to get to Antonio Reeves for Kentucky, who is going to be playing more minutes as the season progresses. He's become a vital part of the offense, especially with injuries and guys being inconsistent. He's been one of the more consistent players. His fantasy points, he has some 30 fantasy point upside, but he does have a couple games where he's disappeared and hasn't gotten as many minutes. But I think it's going to be the thing going forward where he plays more minutes. So I expect that to continue from the last 3 games, which he's played really well in. And his price is just too cheap for his potential in this particular matchup. Then we're going to look at forwards here, and we're going to start off with Oscar Tshiebwe, obviously the best player on the slate, a double-double machine. And in the last game, it looks like he finally got back to, he looked pretty normal compared to most of the season, which he's played well all season long, but he finally had a game where he looked like his old self, shooting the ball pretty well with confidence, getting some dunks, running the floor about as good as I've seen him do this season. He had an injury to start the season, and so that did hurt him a little bit as the season started. But he looks like he's back in the top form, and he's got a nice plus matchup here. I can see this game being one where he ends up getting a 20-rebound game, and he has some really good upside in this matchup. I think this is probably one of my favorite options on the slate in general, simply because of his upside with the rebounding and scoring and the plus matchup from a defensive perspective. Then we're going to look at Hunter Tyson here for Clemson, also pretty expensive. Now, he has some risk here. His last game was his worst game of the season, but prior to that, he had 2 games over 46 fantasy points the last 5 games. He has nice upside. He has a little bit of a low floor, but he does have double-double potential, and he's playing a full complement of minutes. I think he's viable on the slate. If you want to, go off of Oscar, he would be a good way to do it. PJ Hall, also for Clemson. He's probably my favorite forward from Clemson, to be honest, simply because he's been starting. He has only 1 game under 20 fantasy points. He has decent upside here, but he's a little bit overpriced. But he is still viable on the small slate, simply because he's played really well since he started starting, and he's got some nice upside as a result. He's also averaging a 1.18 fantasy points per minute. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to look at Flo Thamba for, let's see, let's find him here. Where'd he go? For Baylor. He's at $4,000. He's a minimum price player here. He's only had 2 games under 10 fantasy points all season long. He starts and plays about 20 minutes a game. He's got some nice upside here, and I look for him to play well in this matchup against Texas Tech and play probably a couple more minutes, similar to what he did against Kansas State. I look for him to have a good game in this one. and he's got some nice upside at this minimum price. He's a good option if you're trying to help pay up for some of the other guys. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.